Hi everyone. Check, check. Microphone on. Yeah, okay, here we go. Hey there, so I'm Chris Chabot. I work at Twitter these days. I head up the developer relations team. And one of the benefits of doing my kind of job, where I work with startup founders and all the companies that are disrupting technology and changing society, is that I get to be a part of inventing the future, and I get to talk to people who are inventing the future. Now, one of the cool things is that as you're doing that, you slowly see trends emerging. So that's what I want to talk to you about today, is living in a mobile future. And what I mean with that is that we all have been talking about mobile first for a while. Maybe we're even thinking about mobile only, and I think mobile is a word we're going to hear quite often in this conference, right? But it doesn't do justice at the thing that's really happening, the thing that's really changing society. I think we're at the cusp of the next big wave of innovation, and that's what I want to talk to you about today. Now, there we go. Sorry, getting used to the clicker. So when we want to understand waves of innovation, it helps to kind of understand the shape of innovation. What do we actually mean when we say innovation, right? What do we mean when you transform society through technological solutions? Now, one of the stories that's always inspired me the most is the venerable printing press. Now, the printing press, of course, we all know, invented things like scientific methods, democracy, free press, free speech, modern-day finances. But it certainly didn't start out that way. In the earliest days, they invented the printing press, and they did what they did up to that point when monks were writing books by hand. They mostly wrote Bibles when they were making by hand. So when they had the printing press, they did the exact same thing. They only printed Bibles, maybe a few works of the classic philosophers, but that was pretty much it. It took a staggering 50 years before something really magical happened. And someone said, well, if people are willing to pay for the most holiest of works, I bet they're willing to pay for an erotic novel. Now, so that's actually the first novel that was ever created. It started literature. And as you can imagine, people said, well, this new fancy novel thing, that's going to end society as we know it. This is the beginning of the end. Just as people always say when new inventions are created, right? It took another 150 years for a group of people that called themselves the natural philosophers to get together. And they said, we're going to do something really special. We're going to say that nothing is true until we can prove it to be true. Now, that sounds like a pretty simple thing, right? But when you think about it, we're very bad at criticizing ourselves. Fortunately, we have a skill that's really complementary to that, and that's that we're awesome at criticizing others. So they said, we're going to do our experiments. We're going to write down not just the outcome, but every step of how we got to the end result. Then we're going to take all those experiments, we're going to put it in a book, and we're going to use the printing press to replicate this cheaply and voluminously and send it to everyone so they can verify that this is actually true. So that was actually the start of scientific method. And it took us 150 years to go from the beginning of the printing press to it really having a major impact on society. So that's the shape of transformative innovation. It's not the technology that necessarily changes society, it's how we start using it. And we see the same thing when we look at the internet. It changed the way we do things, right? Like in 2008, one of the things that happened is that in South Korea, they lifted the ban of USB. For a long time, they banned USB because of the mad cow disease scare. And of course, as you can expect in these situations, there were massive protests. That's not weird. What was really weird, though, was the people doing the protesting. It was teenage girls. Now, you don't expect teenage girls to protest against political decisions, right? That's an unexpected phenomenon. What happened was that all these teenage girls, they were talking to each other on a website forum of the most popular boy band in South Korea. And they shared all the stuff that teenage girls shared, but they also shared that they were very upset that nobody asked the people of South Korea if they were willing to allow USB again. They were not happy that they might be exposed to a health risk without ever being asked if they agreed with it. So they said, we have to do something about this. And this echo chamber on the forum, they got so upset, they said, we're going to go out there and we're going to protest. So tens of thousands of teenage girls flooded the public squares to hold their candlelight protest. As you can imagine, the South Korean government had no idea what to do with this. They went, well, this is something we haven't seen before. So they waited a little while and they thought, well, maybe they'll just go home on themselves. They didn't. So they thought, well, we'll just do what governments always do. We'll call the riot police and we asked them to send them on their way home. So the riot police went to these protests and they did what they always did. They got their water cannons, they got their weapon sticks, and they started dispersing the crowd. The things they hadn't counted on is that teenage girls have smartphones. So they took videos, they took photos, they uploaded those to the internet. Well, we all know the internet, so you can imagine what happened next, right? The reaction was instantaneous, voluminous, and full of outrage. It's a major international scandal. And in fact, it was such a large scandal that the government was forced to shut down. Now, at this point, you might be thinking, what did the government think? Why did they think they could get away with this? Well, all of human history up to that point. The government has always had the power to suppress information flow up to the invention of the internet. Of course, I work for Twitter, so this is a topic I'm very passionate about, but technology has fundamentally disrupted the way politics and information flow works. That's a big deal. And in that, we see the same shape of transformative innovation. And I think that gives us a good template to look at the trends that we're seeing today. And one of the trends that we're seeing today, and I think Paul mentioned that as well, is that mobile phones are essentially different devices. We have 1.5 billion computers in the world right now. The interesting thing about computers, even though we call them personal computers, they're not really that personal in essence, because they're either shared by a family or we use them at work. And even if it's your own computer, you don't really have it with you all the time, right? So it's not really a personal computing device. Mobile phones, on the other hand, are completely different. We always have them with us. They're an extension of ourselves. I don't know about you guys, but I can barely go to the bathroom anymore without having my mobile phone. It's like, oh, I need to go. Where is my phone? So that's a fundamentally different device than a computer is. The other fundamental difference is just the size of this wave of innovation. 1.5 billion computers. We know there's going to be over 3 billion smartphones, 5 billion handsets in total, in 2017. Now that's a big number, and we all make jokes that there's going to be more phones than toothbrushes in the world. And you know, we've heard that all before, but if you take a step back and you think, well, what does it really mean? It means that the internet is going to double or triple in size in the next 3 years. Something as massive and overwhelmingly exciting as the internet is going to double or triple in size. That's staggering to me. That just blows my mind. And the thing that tends to happen when you see growth like that is that new medias always absorb the things that came before it. When we look at our phone, it absorbed game systems and phones, communication devices, Telegram, all those other systems. When you look at the internet, it absorbed newspapers and television and radio. They all go into the new solution, right? So as mobile phones become the internet, and an internet that is 3 times larger than anything we've seen before, it's going to absorb so much more of what came before it. And we can see some early trends of that. We can definitely see a whole bunch of trends where it's starting to absorb things like commerce and payment systems and so much more. And when I say we can see some of those trends, I always look at the edges of society, because we know that that's where innovation happens. It's often said that necessity is the mother of innovation. So when you live in Africa and you don't necessarily have a guarantee of adequate housing or food or water, definitely not access to plentiful electricity, there's no existing infrastructure, life is quite different, right? When you're generally happy, you sit on your couch and you watch television, you play Flappy Bird. But when you're in that situation, that's where real innovation starts happening. So when we look at Africa, we know that one of the problems they had is that doing commerce was difficult because less than 25% of the people in sub-Saharan Africa actually have a bank account. So doing payments and transactions was a difficult thing. So they invented this system called M-Pesa. And M-Pesa is a banking system, a payment system, that uses text messages. And the reason why they use text messages for this as well, well, we all have smartphones here, right? I know I do. And I know my battery's probably going to be empty by the time the conference ends. The nice thing with feature phones is it lasts for days. So if you don't have access to electricity everywhere, that's a really interesting feature. So they build their payment system using text messages. To send somebody money, you would just text a certain number, you can check your balance, you get payment notifications. It works beautifully. In fact, it works so well in this place where there's no existing infrastructure to hold it back, that 43% of the GDP of Kenya is flowing through M-Pesa. Now that's amazing, right? That such a large part of the GDP of an entire country is flowing through a mobile payment system. So that's what happens when you get real innovation affecting society. That's a big chance. We see the same kind of thing when we look at China. Now China is, I think for a lot of people in the West, we think of China as the factory of the world. We don't really think of them as a force of innovation. But that's old thinking. If you've been reading the news recently, you know that China today is a very different beast. They've gone far beyond just being the factory of the world. And the numbers coming out of there are just incredible as well. There's over 14 cities with a population over 5 million. There's 41 cities with a population over 2 million. There's 80,000 people joining the middle class each and every day. That's 80,000 people extra every day that have disposable income to go out and shop. Now, when you have growth like that and you have numbers like that, you get amazing scalability problems as well. And one of the problems they ran into is that you just can't build shopping malls and stores fast enough for these people to be able to shop. You would just have to build too many of them. It's prohibitively expensive. It will cost trillions of dollars to even try. So instead what they do is they use e-commerce. They shop online. For them, this isn't even e-commerce. This is the only way they've ever known commerce. It's just commerce de facto. They will use their mobile phones or their laptops, they will buy something in Chabot, and it gets delivered to their home, and that's just how things work for them. Now, the impact of this, and why I say that commerce is slowly being absorbed by the internet and the mobile revolution, is that if you look at Chabot, for instance, it's the Amazon of China, although they do a little bit more, it's really a marketplace. They organized a new holiday, and they called it Singles Day. And Singles Day is kind of the opposite of what Valentine's Day is. Instead of celebrating that you're a couple, you celebrate that you're single. Well, and how do you celebrate that you're single? Well, you buy a present for yourself, right? So Chabot said, we're going to give you a 50% discount if you celebrate Singles Day with us, and we'll deliver it to you the next day. They sold over $5 billion of goods in a single day. $5 billion in a single day. That's just staggering. So those are really big numbers. The same thing we see when we look at payments. Alipay is, say, the PayPal of the region. And to give this some perspective, we know that PayPal did 180 billion in transactions in 2013. Now, Alipay powers things like Chabot. It also powers WeChat, and there's a lot of magical stuff happening there with WeChat, where you have WeChat on your phone, it has a QR code scanner and a QR code for your identity as well. And people are using it to shop as they're waiting in a subway station, and they're just scanning QR codes on the poster with products that they want to have delivered to their home once they get home from work. It's also used by taxis, for instance. You can't get a taxi in Beijing anymore. They will accept cash payments. They all insist on you using WeChat to pay them. That's incredible. Cash is going out. So Alipay powers a lot of these amazing innovations, right? So remember, PayPal did 180 billion. Alipay in 2013 did $1.6 trillion. 1.6 trillion! I've never talked about financial companies before on the internet that did anything that started with a T. $1.6 trillion. That's what happens when new innovations start absorbing what came before it. E-commerce, payments, and everything else that came before it. So with that, I think we have something of an understanding of what innovation looks like. We've looked at some of the early patterns of where we see previews of where that is today. So I'd like to use a couple minutes to look at like what could be coming after that and what some of the big motivations are and what are the big technological changes are that's going to drive the next big wave. And one of the things that fascinates me endlessly is that the device has essentially changed. It used to be that when I built a website way back in the day, the way that you did it, you built a website, and then if you wanted to have users, you had to build a registration form. And a registration form, well, I'm sure we've all done it back in the day. You had to go, what's your name, what's your street address, what's your zip code, what's your city. Well, by this time, you already figured out that the website doesn't understand European addresses. So you kind of have to go, well, what's an American zip code that I know? Oh yeah, 90210, because that's a television show. And in the end, we lost 90% of all the people to the sign-up process. You lost 90% of your customers because nobody enjoyed filling out these forms. So then the next step was that we said, hey, we got a great solution. We've got all these amazing social providers, Twitter being my favorite obviously, but there's also like Facebook and MySpace and all these other social providers. So you just put a button on your website and people can click that button and that will automatically register them without having to fill in these forms. So that was pretty efficient. That really fixed the problem of losing people in the sign-up process, but it was still not ideal because you were locked into those social platforms. You did not control your customer anymore. And that's where mobile phones changes this completely. It turns it upside down. Because when you have a mobile phone, it already has a phone number. That phone number is your identity. That's what your friends know you by. That's not how they know how to contact you, right? And I also know how to contact my friends by using their phone numbers in your contact list, in your address book on your phone. So I don't need a social graph. I don't need identity. Heck, if I want to share with those friends, I can just send them a text message with a link to where you installed the application. So we don't need social sharing anymore in that way either, right? And beyond that, you even get access to the full photo library. You get access to geolocations and all these other things that we never had access to before. So it fundamentally changes the dynamics of the marketplace. It now is a completely democratic marketplace where everybody gets a social graph. Everybody gets identity. You don't have to depend on others anymore. And that's a big change. And we see that when we look at things like WhatsApp. We know that WhatsApp, it exploded in no time whatsoever, right? And that's exciting. But when they were down for half a day, 5 million people switched over to Telegram. And the reason why they could do that is because Telegram used the same phone number and it used the same address book. So people could just switch over when WhatsApp was down and just keep on chatting with no interruption. Well, that was never possible before. That's a big fundamental shift. So the other big change is that a phone has contextual awareness. Now, when you have a personal computer, it kind of knows what Wi-Fi network it's on. Maybe you can guess what country or city you're in, but it doesn't know a lot about you. Phones, on the other hand, they don't just know your exact location, your direction, the speed at which you're traveling. They kind of know about your habits as well. They know about your calendar. They know about your goals. They know what the weather condition is, the light intensity, the air quality. They know about the people that are close by to you and what your social relationship with them is. It knows so much more about you than any device ever has done. And the effect of that is pretty magical. I remember back in the day when I was working at Google, and that's a little while ago, I was sitting in a meeting, and at some point, a PM I was working with, his phone started vibrating and it said, hey, you better leave now for the airport because there's a lot of traffic and otherwise you might miss your flight. Now, if you use Google now, then you know that that's not a special thing anymore. But back then, before the product was released, that blew my mind. Because there's such a big difference between having information and data and having an actionable advice. That's a big gap, right? Data is just a long list of text. Saying you have to leave now for the airport is something that makes my life better. And that's what mobile devices are capable of doing. They can use the context of where you are, what you are doing, what your goals are, what your environment is like, to create a completely new experience that has never been possible before. The other thing is that technology is slowly disappearing into the background. Wearables is one of those things where we can see that happening, where Instead of having to have a plastic box that we look at, maybe we can use Google Glass. Now, I don't think Google Glass is the final solution, but I think it's an exciting prototype that gets us a step closer to the final solution. Because when you look at technology, when early adopters are playing with it, it's kind of fun, it's exciting, I love it. Boys and toys, you know how it is, right? But it's when technology becomes kind of boring and that people don't think about it anymore, that's where we start seeing really big changes. That's what we've seen in Kenya, that's what we've seen in China. And wearable computing, Internet of Things, that allows technology to move to that side of the scale. It would just become part of what we have with us without having to think about it. And that means that it's going to have an entirely new impact on society. And that's pretty exciting. So the key message for me today is that if you lived on the internet for a while, you would have been forgiven if you thought that innovation is kind of done. You know, all the big things have already been invented. We've seen that, and with a bit of luck, you can kind of build your own business. But the reverse is actually true. If we look at everything what's happened before, it was actually just a stepping stone to the next much bigger thing that's going to have a much bigger impact. We know that the size of the internet is going to triple. We know that so many of the existing systems is going to be absorbed by these internet. We can see previews of that in China and Kenya and everywhere else in the world. So instead of everything being invented and done, the opposite is completely true. Everything is wide open. We're just at the very beginning of defining what the new generation of applications is, what the new context is for us, and how we are going to change society. And that's what I call living in a mobile future. Thank you so much.